4 positions, 11 days, 1 war. Let that sink. Let's look at what Carney actually said here and what he actually did in sequence, because the contradiction itself is not just rhetorical, it's also structural and it has consequences. At Davos in January, Carney positioned Canada as a moderating force globally. He specifically warned against the kind of unilateral military action that 6 weeks later he would endorse. The speech was greeted with what one commentator called a reverent approval. When the war began, Canada was not informed nor consulted. Canadian soldiers in Kuwait were struck by Iranian missiles, and Canadians found out apparently only when satellite images were published. That detail, in my opinion, is worth thinking about carefully. Canadian soldiers were in a war zone, Canadian bunkers were damaged, and the government learned about it and told the people only after satellite images were released. Carney then said, and again I'm quoting him, "It prima facie appears the strikes are inconsistent with international law. But whether they broke international law, quote again, is a judgment for others to make." I think this is the single most telling phrase in Canada's entire response in this conflict, a judgment for others to make, not for Canada, but for others. And then within 48 hours, he said, Canada will stand by our allies. He refused to rule out military participation. But his defense chief said Canada may be called on to help defend Gulf states. And then his defense minister said Canada would not participate. And then Carney himself finally told Parliament that Canada will never participate. 4 positions, 11 days, 1 war. Let that sink. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy, the architect of the Ottawa Treaty banning landmines, one of the most respected voices in Canadian diplomacy, described the government's response as, quote, very confusing. This is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs being diplomatic about the fact that there is no strategy coming out of Ottawa. Now, I want to address the strongest counter-argument because I think it's a real one, and Carney himself has partially talked about it. The counter-argument goes like this. The rules-based order, the international order, was never neutral. It was always applied selectively by the powerful for the powerful. The US invaded Iraq without UN authorization in 2003. Canada joined that coalition of the willing diplomatically while declining to send troops. Israel has occupied Palestinian territory in violation of dozens of UN resolutions. Canada has consistently declined to apply consequences. The rules-based order, Carney himself said at Davos, was never perfectly fair. And I think that argument is intellectually honest, honestly, and I respect it. But here's the problem with it as a justification for Canada's Iran's position. I think it proves too much about our identity. If the rules-based order has always been selectively enforced and Canada is always aligned with the enforcer, then Canada's principled speeches are not principles. They're marketing. They are the brand positioning of a country that benefits enormously from an American security guarantees and American market access, and a country that performs independence while practically is dependent on another nation. Carney knows this. He said it at Davos, and then 6 weeks later, he acted exactly as every other Canadian prime minister before him has acted when Washington made a demand that mattered. And here's the deepest irony. Compare Canada's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 to Canada's response to the US-Israeli war right now in Iran in 2026. In both cases, a country was attacked by a more powerful neighbor without UN authorization in violation of international sovereignty norms, but Canada condemned Russia with maximum force, and Canada supported the United States with maximum ambiguity. The variable that explains the difference is not international law or politics. The variable is Washington. There's a dimension of this crisis that has received almost no serious analysis in Canadian media, in my opinion, and it's frankly the most morally urgent one.